Good evening, everyone. My name is Tony Powers. I am the Mayor Pro Tem here in the city of Decatur. I'd like to welcome you to the third of our four scheduled Decatur 202 strategic planning sessions. Since launching our Destination 2030 process last January, hundreds of Decatur neighbors have shared their thoughts. This is a particular session that's going to engage people on different levels. Given the events at the Capitol last week, many of those images are burned in our head, and we can only think, how can we as a city lead in this attempt to be equitable and racially just? Decatur has gone through a metamorphosis over the last 3 to 4 decades. It doesn't look like the Decatur that I grew up in. However, I still fight for this same Decatur that I call my home and where we've raised our family. Many of you have moved here, raised your families, or many of you are here for the very first time. But whatever the reason, this is how we will make and shape our Decatur. Many of the conversations we have here tonight will be very difficult. Yet we want to give you a safe space in which to have these conversations. You may be in a room with someone you may be in a room completely full of strangers, but just rest assured, this is a space where you can share freely, and we value your input. And on behalf of the entire City Commission, I want to welcome you and thank you for sharing your thoughts tonight with us. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Ed Lee. Ed will lead you through the next steps of where we're going to go tonight. Ed, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Powers, for setting us up for what I think will be an outstanding series of conversations. I am Ed Lee, and my primary role this evening is to help create the conditions for the important conversations that you're going to have with each other during your group conversations. I serve on the Better Together Advisory Board, and that board works to generate awareness of and responses to inequities and injustices in a manner that strives to improve the interactions between community members and city officials while serving as a springboard for policy and programmatic changes. Last summer, Better Together partnered with the Decatur City Commission to establish a speaker series that hosted several scholars and activists who we hoped would assist us in our journey to become a more anti-racist city. You will see excerpts from some of those presentations during tonight's Race and Equity 202. More importantly, we want you to think of our conversations this evening as critical components for any community transformation project. I believe that community and conversation are two sides of the same coin. If we want to change a community, we need to change the types of conversations that are occurring in that community. Different conversations with different people, with different questions being asked, can reveal new and exciting possibilities for the direction that the city of Decatur can go. We hope that this evening provides an opportunity for those new and exciting conversations. Our event is divided into 3 sessions. First, we'll talk a little bit about history, then we'll move to empathy and healing, and we'll conclude with an exploration of policies, practices, and procedures. Each session will comprise of 3 components. The first is a short video excerpt that I alluded to from the Anti-Racism Speaker Series. Second, I will have the honor of having a conversation with members of our community who will help us to contextualize the video that we watch and understand it in relationship to the events that are occurring and have occurred in our city. Third, we will break into discussion groups that will allow you to add your brilliance to the proceedings. While in the discussion group, we ask that each group identify a note taker who will share the group's thoughts with the consulting group that's facilitating the city's strategic plan. We ask that the note taker submit their notes via email to decaturdestination@gmail.com. We have a couple of suggestions for engaging in the group deliberation portion of our proceeding. One, listen to understand and be curious. We show up with different histories, different traditions, and different experiences. And those differences, if we are allowing ourselves to appreciate them and understand them, can become the context in which we create both creative and innovative responses to the most intransigent issues that are affecting our communities. Second, embrace our discomfort as a growing opportunity. You know, we won't grow by listening to the same stories that we tell ourselves. We need to listen to different stories that test and challenge us to be better. And so embrace the discomfort of hearing about a world that you do not live, but try to appreciate it as an opportunity for us to be better together. Third, speak your truth. We ask that you use I statements. Your location and values matter. You do not need others to validate your perspective. It already matters and deserves to be listened to because it is your perspective. Use I statements. Think about your perspective and not the perspective of others. And finally, accept the lack of closure. In Cast, The Origins of Our Discontent, Isabel Wilkerson wrote, "No current day adult will be alive in the year in which African Americans as a group will have been free as long as they had been enslaved. That will not come until the year 2111. Those who came before us invested a lot of time and energy to construct the systems and structures that fuel the maldistribution of resources and opportunities that we are currently witnessing. While we can't dismantle that wall tonight, we can remove several of its bricks. Let me personally thank you for the work that you will do to chisel away at inequality and racial injustice this evening." Our first video that we will watch is from Jane Elliott, and it is followed by a conversation that I am very pleased to be able to have with 3 members of the Beacon Hill Alliance for Human Rights.
We left National T shortly after that and moved back to Riceville, and I took a job teaching in the Riceville Community School, 3rd grade. Our lesson plan in 1968, our lesson plan for the week, we were studying the Indian unit, and we shouldn't have called it the Indian unit because those folks weren't Indians. We had misnamed them for years. We were studying that Indian unit, and our lesson plan for the next day was to learn the Sioux Indian prayer that said, "Oh, Great Spirit, keep me from ever judging a man until I've walked a mile in his moccasins." I was carrying the teepee under my arm when I went into my house that night after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, and I'd been in school all day, so I hadn't heard anything on television or the radio. Walked in, the telephone was ringing. I answered the telephone. It was my sister. She said, "Is your television on?" I said, "No." She said, "You better turn it on." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because they shot him." I said, "Who did we shoot this time?" Because we were in a shooting mode at that time. And she said, "Martin Luther King Jr." And then my world stopped for about 30 seconds. He had been one of our heroes of the month in February. And he was our hero of the month because he was trying to take care of an ugliness called racism in this country. He was trying to bring people together. And he and Malcolm X were coming much, much closer together at that time. Malcolm X believed you needed violence. Martin Luther King Jr. was opposed to violence. They were coming much closer together in philosophy. And the people who run this show knew that if those 2 Black men and their followers combined, they could have upset this country in a hurry and in a positive way, but many of us who are so-called white people don't want to have happen. So they had to kill them both, and they both were killed. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. So I washed and dried the teepee. I fed the kids. I spread the teepee out on the living room floor. I put the kids to bed. I turned on the television, and there was Walter Cronkite saying to 3 leaders of the Black community, when our leader was killed, his widow held us together. Who's going to keep your people in line? I thought, well, he couldn't have said that. He could possibly have been that ignorant. When our leader was killed, was JFK the leader only of white people? I thought he was the leader of all of us. His widow held us together. See how civilized we are? Wait a minute. Who's going to keep your people in line? Now, I thought that blacks were our people. I thought we were all in this together. And here's this man who, previous to that, I had thought God must look like Walter Cronkite because Walter Cronkite knew everything. All of a sudden, he didn't know everything. I was furious, so I changed the channel. And there was Dan Rather saying to three black males, don't you Negroes think you should feel sympathy for us white people during this experience because we can't feel the anger at this killing that you black peoples can. I was, for the love of God, how could you not be angry at hearing that another human being who had no ulterior motive other than to make things better for all of us had been killed? How could you think that you don't have to be angry about that? I rolled that teepee up, I threw it in the floor of the closet. I got my husband's supper. When he came in, he said, they killed him, didn't they, Jane? I said, yeah, they did. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to do what Hitler did. What are you talking about? I said, I'm going to treat my children positively or negatively on the basis of a physical characteristic over which they have no control tomorrow. He said, what do you mean? I said, I mean, I'm going to split my class according to their eye color, just as Hitler did. One of the ways you would have got thrown into the gas chamber during the Nazi years was by having brown eyes. If you had a good German name, but you had brown eyes, they threw you into the gas chamber because they thought you might be a Jewish person who was trying to pass. He said, you can't do that. If you do that, you lose your job. I said, if I lose my job for teaching the truth to my students, I would rather not teach in Riceville. He said, Jay, we need that money. These kids need that. I said, Daryl, this is what I'm going to do. He was really upset and really worried because he knew something I didn't know. He rode back and forth from Riceville to Charles City to the Oliver plant every day with grown white males who were born and raised in Riceville, Iowa. And they said the kinds of things in his presence that he had stopped saying once he got to Waterloo and learned that the things they said weren't true. But he went along to get along because that's what we do. And someone has said the only thing necessary for the perpetuation of evil is for good people to do nothing. Now, all you have to do when racist remarks are made, all you have to do is keep your mouth shut. And that will perpetuate the evil of the racist remarks. All you have to do when you hear about a black man being shot for no reason except that he wasn't obedient enough where the white policeman was concerned. If you just sit back and watch and say, well, he asked for it, that's perpetuating the evil of racism. We need to put a stop to that.
Just want to invite Funtahai Mwali Davis and Genesis Reddick from the Beacon Hill Black Alliance for Human Rights to unmute themselves. And we're going to have a little bit of a conversation. And I think the first thing that I want to do is to thank you all for the tremendous work that you have been doing since 2015 in order to challenge the way in which systemic racism has ordered the city of Decatur and to move us in a direction that all of us should be very proud of. One of the things that we tend to think about when we think about history is just this thing that occurs not a part of our community, or this thing that happens over there. One, I'm curious, as you've been doing your work for human rights in the city of Decatur, what are some of the histories that you have unearthed that you think informs the current ordering of the city? What should we know about that many of us may not be aware of?
Good evening, Brother Lee, and thank you for having us. It is indeed an honor. One of the things that resonates with me as we came and moved into Decatur, Brother Powers talked about those who have come to Decatur, and we moved here from South Fulton 8 years ago and had an opportunity to spend a great deal of time with Mayor Emerita Elizabeth Wilson. And one of the things that she would talk about is what that square meant to Black folk and the concern that many had in even coming into the square as not necessarily being a safe space, as the place where the Ku Klux Klan, as they marched through the Beacon Hill community, would then gather around that courthouse in that space. And so I think that helps frame for us the work that we've been doing around the Confederate monument, as Fonta will talk about, as well as Sister Genesis will talk about around the canon. And so there is a historical root that exists that we have to address. Even really what started most of our work was around the issue of equity in education. And we found, again, Dr. Duty at the time was new to the district, did a report after being prompted by my wife, Jana, around issues of equity in discipline, as well as in an achievement gap. And that, if you look at that report, and I pulled it out today, what was said that should disturb us all was that this is not a new issue, right? And so he included the documentation from the Department of Education about city schools of Decatur from 2009, from 2008, so there's this ongoing issue. And one of the things that I think is helpful for us to kind of understand is that if it were not Black folk that were so disproportionately dealt with, there would have been a state of emergency. But because it's acceptable for us to be handled the way that we've been handled in this country, in this community, then the disparity in graduation, in discipline, you could talk about incarceration, you could talk about in every aspect of our lives is just almost acceptable. And as Sister Elliott says, people just stand by and just say, oh, okay, it just kind of happened. What did they do wrong? They weren't smart enough. So I'll end there, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about how that relates to our work in Decatur.
Fonta, Genesis, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. And alluded to this, the Confederate monuments. There are a lot of people who say, well, that's the past. Why are we wanting to disrupt history? Why are we trying to change history? I know that a lot of the work that you're doing is really around the question of the role of the Confederacy and the memorialization of the Confederacy. What would you say to those people who say, stop trying to change history? That was the past.
I would say, Ed, as we talk about, for example, the Lost Cause Monument specifically in the city of Decatur and even others that we've seen throughout the country, there's a difference between history and propaganda. So I think that's important to remember. And there's been such a whitewashing done in the curriculum where our children are not getting the full history and the true history of all peoples. And that's problematic by itself. But those statues, those monuments, those structures still standing sends a conflicting message. Those statues, those monuments represent an ideology of white supremacy, but yet we have the expectation that our children behave as good human beings and anti-racist. But we allow these structures that represent and are very much connected to some of the racist behaviors that unfortunately we've seen from our children in the last couple of years and years past. Both cannot exist. Not the expectation that they act one way, but then we permit these structures that represent their behavior to not have an impact or influence. Even if it's unconscious, there is a message that's being communicated. It's problematic.
Yeah, one of the things that I think it's important for us to think about when we think about the Confederacy is when these monuments were erected and who supported them. That in fact, they were many a times responses to advancement of Black folks, and that this was the way in whether those communities at that time to send a message that you're not wanted, your advancement endangers us and places us at risk. So this notion of those monuments were placed at a time of honoring the Confederacy. No, they were in response to a different message. Genesis, I'm curious about, Fonta speaks to, in some ways, the public education. of Confederate monuments that happens. I'm interested in your thoughts about the way in which we've started the school systems operate and the educational system functions, and the history that lives there, and the things that you are concerned about.
Yes, so going to the Decatur City Schools, I have been exposed to a lot of things that a lot of my, I would say, Black peers in other systems don't get the opportunity to have. But even with more education opportunities, there's still a lack of representation in terms of Black history. Many times Black students are only taught about slavery or the oppression of people, not only in the States or the Western Hemisphere, but also in Africa. I will sit in history classes where we are constantly talk about the continent of Africa, but not the vast kingdoms and the trade routes and everything prior to slavery, but rather European colonization and oppression on Africans. And so our history is basically just splattered with white supremacy, where it's almost a blinding, it's almost blinding. We often have to work around that and have to look into our own sources of material, find our own information, which is so much harder because often our history, the education of Black people is so covered by how we've been oppressed and not the glory and all the amazing things that have been achieved by us. So, yeah.
Is there a part of Decatur's history that fits within that narrative you just spoke of, that you've contextualized it in a way that makes sense to me and makes me want to go and do some more readings and revisit some of the things I've learned about the queens and kings and the kingdoms? But are there, as you've been doing this work of being a community organizer, how does that situate within what you're thinking about for Decatur?
Well, I have been working with a project called the Commemorating King Project, which Beacon Hill has sponsored. And the whole project is to tell a story about how Dr. Martin Luther King was arrested in Atlanta and sentenced to probation right in Decatur, right behind my school, in a building that was called the DeKalb building. He ended up doing a sit-in with the Atlanta Student Movement, which broke his probation, in which Judge Oscar Mitchell, who was a notorious racist and a very prominent judge in the DeKalb courts, gave him 4 months in a chain gang, which is hard labor. And that ended up with the Kennedys getting involved for political reasons, of course, and pushing negotiations with the governor and Judge Oscar Mitchell to roll back on the chain gang sentencing and getting King out of prison. And this ultimately convinced King to start supporting the Kennedys, which ultimately shifted the Black vote. So me and a group of my other peers have been learning about this story, and we're looking to place a marker about it because not many people know about it. And it's a very prominent part of our history, specifically in Decatur, knowing that Decatur is a racist place, but what had such a racist past, but also contributed to the civil rights movement and what we know in history today.
We have one final minute or so for this conversation, but I'm definitely going to pick up with each of you offline to continue this because there are various questions that I have, but I'm interested in sort of where Malawi was in thinking about Decatur Square and the notion of safe spaces for Black folks. Do you have some thoughts of what could be done to make that feel as if it is a space that is inviting for folks who historically have not felt that it was?
Yeah, I think just like in a class, and I think I just want to applaud Sister Genesis. This is a young sister who's at Decatur High School, so I just like her response it blows your mind, but that's the work of her parents and Fanta and others who have supported her. So I just wanted to put put her response in context. But part of it is just seeing yourself in spaces. Just like when she opens up a book, she should see herself. She should see her hairstyle, that beautiful hairstyle that her and Fonte are wearing. She should see herself, and she could see that if that was included. And so I think part of it is for that space to be a space where Black and brown folk can see themselves, and that it is not one that is at all intimidating. And I think Fonte's work and the work of Paul McClellan and others around art and the power of art in public spaces is really speaks to this very issue. So, the hope is that John Lewis statue will be there at some point to bless us. But then there has to be more. It can't just be one single icon because we are, a multitude of people who've had incredible experiences and just absolutely resilient. And I think that should be reflected as well. But I think Fonte, her work is really strong in that space.
And I want to mention too with that it's really important as we talk about this issue of race that we don't make it just a Black and white issue. So as we work to put affirmative art in places like the square, we also have to still remember those other structures that exist of white supremacy, such as the canon from the quote unquote Indian Wars of 1836 that was used to commit genocide against the Muskogee Creek people to which this land belongs to. So again, both should not be forced to exist, right? Because there was great injury, harm, genocide done to this group of people. So there's an African indigenous connection we have to keep in mind. And that racism, again, is not just a Black-white issue. We have to broaden the conversation. So that canon needs to be removed as well as we work to make the square more inclusive.
I want to thank you for not just being here this evening, but as I identified earlier, for the tremendous amount of work that the city of Decatur is very fortunate to have folks of your brilliance, your capacity, your dedication, and your interest to make us all better working on these issues. And so thank you for all that you do to make us better. And so we're going to move to our breakout groups that we're going to have now. If you've registered prior to 2 p.m. today, you and the folks who are in your group have received a discussion guide via email. And so we have some questions in this session that we're interested in you having. If no one in your group has the discussion guide, you can access it via the link that's in the chat box that's on the screen right now. Once again, we're asking for one person to volunteer to be the note taker, and that if there are technical issues that you're having, please drop down in the box to Renee, Madison, or Woody, and that they can help you get to the place where you need to be. So what we're interested in is for you to move to your small groups now and for you to think about and explore how has the history of racism and how it informs the various economic disparities showing up in Decatur today. What is that history that you know and are aware of that you've heard shared this evening? How do you think it informs where we are right now? Welcome back, everyone. We are going to move into the second session, our first portion of our conversation. We're talking about history. And while the past is not prologue, there are definitely traces that are left that informs who we are, what our communities look like, and how we exist. And in some ways, we are interested in figuring out a way of us changing how those histories have informed us and thinking about that in a more personal level in the second part of our conversation. So we have a video by the person who is our second presenter in our speaker series, Dr. Catherine Meeks. And then I am very much looking forward to an opportunity to have a short conversation with Dr. Eve Rose Persina, who is the Vice President of Equity and Inclusion at Agnes Scott College.
when I talked to Ed about what this evening should be and how I should characterize it, we talked a lot about wanting to address the collective work of creating spaces where the dignity of every person is being honored. I don't think that the dignity of every person can be honored until people are able to bring that same kind of honoring of the dignity of themselves. A lot of what's happening has to do with the systems of oppression that have been put into place and the ways in which we have acquiesced to those systems. But a lot of it also has to do with the spaces inside of ourselves that we have not confronted and dealt with. So as you listen to me, as you think about this is a lot to be trying to get somebody to understand in a short period of time. But there is the notion that we have inner communities as well as living in a community and being a part of an outer, larger community. And I want to ask you to spend a little bit of time right now thinking about who lives in your inner community. Who is there? What kinds of voices do you catch yourself having to entertain as you go through your workday or play day or rest day or whatever way you're spending a day? Who's there? Who's speaking to you? What are they saying? And how do you feel about some of those voices, some of those ways of looking at things? Some of you may be old enough to remember the comedian Flip Wilson, who used to, no matter what thing he was being called into accountability for, he always would make the great assertion, well, the devil made me do it. Well, that's not exactly accurate. It wasn't the devil, but it was those disparate voices inside of him that was figuring out a way to interrupt him and to cause him to have to pay attention to them, causing him to having to own them. And he was in no way ready to do that. So I want you to think for some time now with me about, do you have any such spaces? Do you have, some thoughts that come up, some sides of yourself that you see, and you can hardly allow that to exist? You can hardly allow that particular way of being and thinking to, you don't want it to be a part of yourself, so you just kind of try to smush it away and cover it up or ignore it or say, oh, shucks, you want to just dismiss it. Well, dismissing it doesn't work because it's always going to be there. So then if you don't pay attention to these things that belong to you, your way of thinking, what you grew up with, what are your prejudices? How come you've made up your mind about certain things? Where did those thoughts come from? These are ways to interrogate yourself and start to understand who does live here in this person. That's me walking around, that's me working, that's me engaging with people. When you ask those questions and pay attention to the answers and are seriously trying to interrogate yourself so you can get a good answer, a truthful answer. The personal and the collective are connected, and the inner and the outer are connected. People want to sometimes argue that it's a waste of time to pay too much attention with your inner self. You don't want to get to be so self-focused until you can't function. But the person who tries to live their life without paying any attention to who they really are is somebody who is in deep denial and trying to live their life without knowing how much who you really are is going to affect what you really do and who you have any chance of becoming in terms of the larger world. So as you go about your work in Decatur of wanting to have a city that affirms the dignity of every person, regardless of what their job is, of what they do, how much they went to school or didn't go to school or whatever, I think that some of this way of thinking that I'm talking about can really help you with becoming much more liberated and being willing to see liberation be a part of the way we do things. Some of it's funny how much power we have as individuals, even though we think sometimes we have no power. We have so much power that we can use to change the things that are external to us if we would be willing to do the internal work that sets that power free.
So Rose, thank you for joining us this evening. I've listened to this video with Catherine Meeks a couple of times because I'm fascinated by her conception of this notion of the inner community. And I'm interested in your thoughts on it, and where do you see some intersections between it and the work that you do around racial healing?
Hi, well, thank you so much for having me. Pleasure is all mine. So delighted to actually talking to you. You're like a superstar in my video world because I'm always watching this great series you've done on anti-racism. So I feel honored. Yeah, amazing. This was an amazing clip. It really was. The connection between the personal and the collective she talks about, when I was listening to it, I'm like, that's empathy, right? That's just how we build that. And so you asked me about how do I see the connection? There's so many places, so I'll try to be succinct because I know we only have a few minutes. But part of my strategies years ago, even before racial healing, and racial justice were trending, had always been focused on connecting, creating opportunities for people to connect across their differences. And there's various ways to do that. There's so many ways to do this, but I happen to be working in higher ed where we have almost, on a college campus, on a residential college campus. So we almost have an audience, right? We have students who we are a very diverse school. So we have students from different backgrounds that are living and learning and studying together. And so it's a perfect opportunity and they are in their development years. So it's the perfect opportunity to help build that community where we help connect the personal and the collective. So they are self-developing, but they're also part of a larger community. And so we do this through a series of things. And I just want to, one of my biggest, one of my, I guess, proudest work that I've seen happening on our campus is something we call Courageous Conversations. And the Courageous Conversations, they do them on different campuses. We didn't invent them. But what they do is, in our campus, at least the way we did it, is we pair people one-on-one to have an initial personal conversation. And then we bring them on a larger group and then a community debrief during MLK. Part of that, Ed, is the racial healing piece. We are also a campus that is one of the truth, racial healing, and transformation center around the nation. There's 24 of them. And so another component of that work is the work we do around racial healing, which I'm happy to talk a little bit more about. But that's where I see the connections. And also in the teaching, right? We have fabulous faculty teaching issues around justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We're doing work on decolonizing the curriculum. And so that's where all this connection has to happen. You're developing the self, but you're also helping students become part of a larger, she calls it the collective, right? That's what I think she refers to it. And so, yeah, just I don't want to keep talking because I know you probably have other things.
Well, the notion of sort of a courageous conversation means a sense, to me, I take that as a sense of vulnerability, that I am willing to place something at risk in engaging in that conversation, because in some ways I'm probably going to be challenged on the way in which I see the world, I think about the world, the stories that my parents have told me, the stories that my peers tell me, and that there may be some sense that they are inaccurate, are not true, or even the stories that I tell myself, those inner voices that she is speaking to. How do you have some thoughts of how do I prepare myself or equip myself to want to be vulnerable in that regard?
So for the individual, we do these obviously through workshops and training, but there are some very simple, well, I wouldn't say simple, there are some steps that we can do, whenever we are start in a racial healing circles or we start in a courageous conversation, we usually begin with some self-questioning or reflection. And I think she talks about it in the sense of inner voices, but it's really for me also to identify where do those inner voices came from, right? What was your upbringing like? What was your experience growing up? Just really asking people to do some self-reflection, and anybody can do this anywhere, right? I mean, there's a simple exercise I do with people. I say, draw a circle, and then for every time you are exposed to something around this racism, you draw a part of the face, to see how are you exposed to it. You'll be surprised, or you won't be surprised, because that about less than 50% of our population wouldn't be able to draw a full face because their exposure to racial diversity in their upbringing and positive places is not a lot. So that's a self-questioning you can do to see where those come from. And then you can move into the more intimate one-on-one, maybe even trio conversation, but with the willingness, as you I think alluded to, that there's just not one truth. Your truth may not be my truth. And it's to create that space where we can all put it out, speak our truth, learn from it, acknowledge our collective past, as we were talking in the first segment. And what does that past mean in terms of when we plan in the future? That requires a lot of vulnerability for people to do this. But yet, those who begin with the self-reflection are able to move forward. So those would be my tips, I guess, is for beginning to, how do you identify those inner voices?
Yeah, one of the things that you got me thinking about is sort of the role of decentering the self in some way, of understanding, if you will, that those voices are not necessarily voices that we want to listen to or that we have asked to show up in our minds, and that they frame the way in which we view the world in ways that can be very problematic to our own value system. That as you were talking, I was thinking back to Fanta encouraging us to not view this through a black-white binary, that there are voices in our heads, particularly as good Southerners that many of us are, that we process this in a particular way. And that one of the things that it sounds like you're suggesting we can do is step back, decenter the self a little bit, and think about the world from someone else's perspective.
You said it better than me. Absolutely. And it's also being able to put also yourself in that person's shoes, right? It's going back to empathy, which I think she talks about as well, is that not only you see it from the other person's perspective, but how do you put in yourself in that place? Oh my gosh. I mean, I've asked my students in the past to imagine themselves, driving, to put themselves behind the wheel as a person of color. And then there's a policeman, police car pulling behind you. And what, I'm not saying, and I know that I'm saying something very naive here, but I think over time, as you start doing this type of exercises, you put yourself in that place, you begin to identify with the other. Because one of the ills in our society, in my little opinion, is that part of our trouble is that we have a really hard time identifying with the other. And we saw that in what happened in DC, right? I mean, we saw when the police, for example, is able to see themselves in the so-called perpetrators, they react different. But when they cannot identify, the reaction is different. And that's kind of the roots of part of the roots, I should say, of a lot of issues of prejudice and discrimination, is that we are unable to put ourselves, or we don't create the time to decenter ourselves and put ourselves in the other person's shoes sometimes. So yeah, you got it.
Thank you for joining us this evening. And I'm so pleased for this conversation and excited for all of the future conversations that I'm going to have the opportunity to have with you.
Same here.
So we're going to move back into our small groups. And one of the things that we're interested in you thinking about is really that notion of the inner community, and how that inner community informs the way in which you think about race and even questions of vulnerability and who gets to participate in your outer community. We'll continue on our journey. We started talking about history and how history informs who we are now. Those traces of history is informing the ways in which we come to understand what our value systems are, who gets privileged, who gets listened to, those inner voices, those inner communities that Dr. Meeks spoke of. We had an opportunity to talk with a collection together around what those inner voices are saying to us. And someone in our conversation brought to the proceedings a discussion around implicit bias and unconscious bias and the ways in which those things, we don't really know how they're informing us. Now we want to move to a conversation around policies, practices, and procedures. And we'll start that with a video of Tim Wise, an anti-racism activist. And I'm very excited about the opportunity to contextualize that in the city of Decatur with a conversation with Dr. Marianne Banks, who is the equity coordinator at the City Schools of Decatur.
Systems and institutions operate using policies, practices, and procedures, operating under processes that become normal to us and which we never think about and we never interrogate. And even if they aren't deliberately intended to produce vast racial disparities, can have that consequence. Those policies, those practices, those procedures can perpetuate inequity in terms of schools, in terms of jobs, in terms of income and wealth, in terms of the justice system, even if that isn't the intention of the people in those institutional spaces. I want to talk about that. And the reason I want to focus on that is because the other part's easier, right? To talk about overt racism, even, I'm not even talking about neo-Nazis necessarily, or, semi-psychotic law enforcement officials that snuff out a life for nearly 9 minutes. Those are extreme examples. But just even baseline discrimination is at least technically illegal, right? So at least theoretically, we have a legal framework to address racial discrimination that's obvious in the job market, or racial discrimination that's obvious in lending, or racial discrimination that's obvious in any other institutional space like schooling. The problem is that so much of what perpetuates racial inequity in this country isn't illegal in the first place, that unless we address that part, unless we address the part that is creating injustice, but which is actually completely legal. The civil rights laws don't touch those things. If we don't address that, we're only dealing, going back again to the iceberg metaphor, with maybe the 10% of the racism that we can easily see, and we're ignoring the 90%. So when I talk about that 90%, the systemic piece, the stuff that's under the waterline and that isn't even against the law that we sometimes miss, what am I talking about? And how does that relate to your community and mine here in Nashville, or any other community to which I could be speaking? Well, let's think about a few examples. And these will be obvious, and there are probably others that you can think of, and we can talk about that during the Q&A and the dialogic part of the evening together. But you think about education, think about schooling, right? We live in a country where we take unstandardized children from unstandardized families, living in unstandardized homes in unstandardized communities, going to unstandardized schools, teaching unstandardized curriculum with unstandardized resources. And at the end of all that, we give them standardized tests to determine if they're going to graduate from high school. If so, are they going to go to college? If so, what kind of college? In fact, we start this process long before high school. We start giving standardized tests to these unstandardized kids with unstandardized resources from like first grade on, earlier than just about any other country on the planet that we like to compare ourselves to. We start that process of sorting and separating and tracking. Now, what happens when you give standardized examinations to unstandardized kids who weren't taught the same stuff and who didn't have the same resources to master the same material? Well, what happens is that by definition, you perpetuate inequity. Or when we think about the job market, for instance, you ask any employer, when you're hiring people, what do you look for? And they say, well, we look for the people with the most qualifications, and we look at the resumes, and we hire based on experience, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we do that to some extent. But what we know, because there was a study to this effect, it was written up in the New York Times 5 or 6 years ago, I doubt things have changed since then. found that in the wake of the Great Recession, what was that, 2009, 2010 or so, finally come out of it around 2010, 2011, we're starting to. After the Great Recession, about half of the new jobs in the post-recession economy, and this is likely still the case, about half the new jobs, 47%, as I recall, were being filled not through some open competition where we just all throw our resumes in a pile and the most qualified person, whatever that means, gets the job. Almost half of the jobs were being filled through networking, and not just like broad-based networking, but one particular form of networking. People who already work for the company writing letters of recommendation on behalf of people they knew, friends, family, neighbors, golfing buddies, whatever, right? To try to get them a job. In other words, if I know Jim over in the HR department, Jim writes me a letter, now I got the inside track on that new gig. Or if I know Peter over in, accounting, right? Peter can write me a letter and I got the inside track on that new gig. Now, in theory, that doesn't have anything to do with race. But in practice, what do you think it has to do with race? Well, we know because the research finds that the people that are more likely to know Jim are going to be people like Jim. Right? No offense to Jim. Jim might be a good guy, but the people Jim's likely to know, the people who existing employees of a company or an organization or a firm or whatever are more likely to know are people like themselves. And therefore, the people for whom they'll write those letters of reference tend to be very much like themselves, which means that white folks and white men in particular, and upper middle class white men in particular, will have the inside track on those jobs, not because they're the most qualified, not because they're the best for the job, but because they know the right people. So if that's how half the jobs are being filled, even if not a single HR director in America were racist, even if not a single employer were overtly bigoted, the outcomes in terms of who is hired will be pretty much the same as if half of them were bigots, right? Or as if half of them harbored those racist prejudices or sexist prejudices or classist prejudices. You could be the most qualified person for that next opening at the firm or the company or whatever, but if you're a person of color, a woman of any color, or a working class white guy for that matter, you're out of luck. You don't even know that the job exists. We sometimes talk about, inequality of opportunity using a racetrack metaphor, and we say, some people are starting out 3 laps behind in a 5-lap race, which is bad enough, and I'll come back to that. This is worse than that. This is not even knowing there's a race. Right? Not even knowing where the track is at, like not even knowing that there's a competition that you could even potentially enter if you don't know the right people. So that's how institutional inequity can be perpetuated. Systemic racist exclusion can be perpetuated without a single overt bigot in the room.
Dr. Banks, when I hear Tim Wise talk about that, one of the things I'm reminded of is Eddie Gallad in his book, Professor of African American Studies, talks about the overemphasis on the spectacular, and that we need to think about the everydayness of systems and structures and how they impact our lives. And I see this conversation about policies, practices, and procedures as one that's around the everydayness of the existence. And I'm excited that you're here because you are dealing with the everydayness of the way in which systems of domination grade up against students and produce inequalities. What are some ways in which are the policies and practices that have been changed in the city of Decatur school system to address the everydayness of racism?
Well, Ed, I want to start by saying thank you so much for having me. And I'm going to have to ditto Yves Rose because I've been watching you do these sessions. And when Woody told me I had the opportunity to talk to you, I was like, well, maybe I should ask him the questions because he's brilliant. Why is he asking me questions? So I'm really, really pleased to be able to speak with you this evening and to, share with the community. I think there's a balance, right, that we're looking at when we talk about the everydayness of trying to change lives and trying to change systems. And it comes from two directions. Like there's this direction of people's hearts and minds, right? Where you want to get in there and you kind of want to work with them and you want to help them think differently and be differently. And that's part of it. And it's a good part. It's a really feel good part. And you set that aside. But you do set that aside because without the most important part, which is the policy part, there is no change. Usually for people to change, there has to be something they call interest convergence, right? Which means that I'm going to change because there's a reason for me to change. And without that reason, I may not do so. It's just human nature, is how we are. So part of making this the everyday is creating policy that keep people accountable so they do not they're not able to wiggle out of it. They have no choice. There is interest convergence for them to behave in that way. So in City Schools of Decatur, what we tried to do, Beacon Hill has been a very valuable partner. And I think that when Beacon Hill started pressing for changes to take place in the district, a little bit before then and definitely after then, we started having some real conversations about what does this take? What does this change take? What does it mean? And so we decided to approach it from three ways. We call it normalize, organize, and operationalize. You have to normalize, which is the idea of making talking about race normal, because it's something that's not normal in our society. It's not considered polite. It's not something we do. Once you do that, you have to then organize by teaching people how to do things differently, helping teachers learn culturally relevant pedagogy, things like that. But then you also have to operationalize. And so you have to go in and look for the policies that are inequitable and change those fundamental policies so that the outcomes are beneficial for all students. And that's kind of where we are with that.
I am also attracted to the notion of interest convergence. And I think that it probably says something about me and my inability to buy into altruism as a function of life, that we tend to do things that we get value from or make us feel good. If you were talking to folks who don't buy into the notion of more school funding in order to address some of the systemic inequalities that show up in testing, in access to AP courses, in which students ultimately end up in the elite public and private schools in the United States. How do you speak to them about how it's in their interests? Where is the convergence of interest there?
That's a great question. I wish I could remember this gentleman's name, but there was a teacher who wrote a book about his experiences in the classroom. And what he said was he was at a private school in an all-white community, and they just couldn't wrap their minds around why they wanted to change policy to help the one or two Black kids that were in the school, and that were really struggling and really having discipline problems, academic problems, et cetera. And he's like, yeah, you don't want to do anything now, but when they grow up and knock you in the head, then you're going to wish you had done something, right? So it's this idea of we take care of people because that's who we should be as a society. It's the idea, the fundamental nature of society as a whole. And I think that if we are going to make equity an everyday thing that we experience, then we're going to have to really understand the idea of equity. Right? It doesn't mean equal. It doesn't mean unequal. What it means is each person gets what they need in order to be successful. So now for that to happen, unfortunately, somebody is going to have to give up something, because you're going to have to share some of what you have so that the person who has none will be able to do something with it. And I think that is a sticking point for a lot of people. So I think really just showing them the long-term outcomes of the decision-making processes. What happens when we have a populace that's not educated? What happens when we have people who are unable to interact with people from various backgrounds or various cultures? What does that look like long-term?
I appreciate the process that you outlined of normalizing, and I can't read my handwriting all the time. I think I wrote organizing and operationalizing.
Mhm.
I'm curious about the impediments to the operationalization. What have you seen showing up in your work that has made the operationalization more difficult?
Thank you for asking that. That's something that I've been thinking a lot about, specifically now, given all of the pressures of COVID-19, right? That has taken the idea of disproportionality and just put it on a whole different level. And right now we have an entire community that is at odds with each other over, should we come back to school? Should we not? What happens to students if they do go back or if they don't? And these are all valid concerns. And I think that one of the biggest impediments, honestly, to the removal of systemic racism, in my opinion, is the amount of time in which systemic racism has been in play, right? We're talking 250 years and counting of this being the norm in the United States of America. So when we get together and we begin to change policy and we begin to push back, it's something that isn't going to happen overnight. And I hate to say that and I hate to hear that, but I know that it's true. So just getting people to understand that it's happening, even if you don't see it happening. I'll give you a perfect example. We always talk about the education debt that we owe students in city schools of Decatur. Not students are behind because they're inadequate. No, students are behind because they've suffered institutionalized racism in our school system, right? So we talk about how we make that up and we say we want to pay the education debt. And we've been working on that just vehemently for 3 to 4 years, but the education debt isn't paid. We still have disparity between our Black students or our students of color and our white students. So that's something that's unacceptable. It's heartbreaking, it's frustrating, but at the same time, if you just see that, you say, well, City Schools of Decatur isn't doing anything. But there are so many things that we are putting into place and so much work that we're doing that I believe is building a foundation for change. But you have to see that change in order to recognize it and appreciate it. And that may be further down the road. I really appreciated what Genesis said when she talked about curriculum, because curriculum is a huge hole in City Schools of Decatur. People of color need to be able to look at curriculum and see themselves and understand themselves and know more about themselves and feel some kind of connection. So right now we're doing a huge overhaul of a lot of the curriculum across the district because, again, we need to make it more inclusive. We need to make it more, I guess, accessible to all students.
Dr. Banks, I want to personally thank you for the tremendous work that you're doing with the City of Decatur schools. I am one who believes that we can learn lessons in lots of different places, and that the demonstration models of what we can do right in various other parts of our city, whether it's the business sector or employment, I think that a lot of the things that you all are doing there are things that we can look at and model and take. So thank you for creating some examples at home of what we should be doing and doing it right.
Thank you. And Ed, moving forward, it is Mary, like the Virgin, but not quite.
So we will move to our breakout conversations. And what we want to have a conversation is around policies, practices, and procedures. And where do you see those that are difficult to address and how we can address them? So in our time remaining, we're now interested in getting some idea of the conversations that you had in your small group sessions. And we asked someone to take notes, and each group graciously had someone who did that. And that we would like for that person to take maybe a minute to identify what was a theme that maybe you saw across your 3 conversations. What was an aha moment that you had or that you saw someone light up when something was said in your group conversations? Or maybe it was someone who had an idea that was just brilliant and that you think that the rest of us deserves to hear that. or see that or understand what they said. And so we'll go, and I will start backwards, and we'll start with group. What is our largest group? Or let's go forward. 13. So group 13. Just take a moment to share, please.
Leslie, was that us?
I have no idea. I don't know the number.
Well, why don't we just popcorn it then? If you have a thought, jump in and share.
I'll go for our group. We were having a good conversation about some ideas. One idea was subsidizing for Black-owned businesses in Decatur. That could be a way to level the playing field a little bit more. And also, I really like the idea about educational opportunities for lower income children in the summer to try to, I understand there's probably some of that going on now, but that's a way to help lower income children kind of gain some of that, lose less during the summer than some of the more privileged children might be going to camps and things like that. And then we also talked about climate justice, trying to keep people in their homes and helping to decrease energy costs by weatherizing their homes and things like that, so they're not spending so much money on their energy bills.
Thank you. John, jump in.
So, hi, John Schwenkler here. We had some great conversation, and I was privileged to take some notes. And I'll just leave you all with the last question, because most of what we did was talk about the problem. And I think what you're asking for is more on the solution side. And we didn't have a lot of answers. But Alexis gave us this question as we were leaving. How do we get our town to understand that everyone benefits by helping out people that are less privileged? It helps out everybody, not just the people that are needing affordable housing or whatever it might be. Helps us all out.
Yeah, it's in all of our interests.
Hi, this is Leslie. Our group also had a lot of really great discussion around the different questions. One thing that as I was reviewing the notes just now that I wanted to share with the full group is when we talked about the impediments to healing and reconciliation, our group talked about that there's a need for, in order to heal, that we need to have trust, open communication, and be really clear about our belief systems and be connected to those belief systems. And there was the question about, can we really forgive, not seek revenge, and really work to heal? And that's really what we need, is that willingness to not seek revenge, being open, being willing to do the hard work.
Excellent. Thank you, Leslie.
I can speak for group 10. So we want to say, first of all, that racism is real in our school and our community. We feel that we need to continue to be educated, think about others' perspectives, recognize longstanding economic inequality and the white supremacist system that's led us to this point in our role, and work together against fear and NIMBYism.
Hey everyone, I'm Adam. I could just share from group 1. We kind of threw out the questions. I guess one theme that we kept coming back to in terms of both the current issue and the history indicators around housing and affordable housing. sort of the history of racism in the city, kind of creating this current crisis, which it does not feel as though there is enough urgency in dealing with. And so that's something that we talked about, sort of was a thread that went throughout the three questions. Thanks.
Nice.
I can speak for group 7. For each of the questions, we noted how declining diversity within Decatur kind of makes work to build equity harder, because it makes it harder to pull from diverse experiences and see things. And we decided that we need to see what we're not seeing and figure out which questions to keep at the forefront, and charge every member of our community with holding the value of increasing equity. And if we see something, say something. We talked about also that the community could do with increasing awareness of who to speak up to regarding non-compliance with our equity standards. And for example, one of our members told me about the anti-discrimination ordinance that we have that I didn't know about, and that there's an avenue to lodge a complaint when that's not followed.
I love that notion that we need other people to help us see what we're not seeing.
Group 8 talked about the lack of lack of affordable housing, when the implications that has on segregation and lack of diversity in Decatur, which is things that other people have talked about. But a member of our group brought up something that I thought was a really excellent, very clear idea of something that could be done, and that is to have the Decatur police force start thinking about some of the things that have come out of the what is called defund the police program, but the idea of allocating funds within the police department for other types of professionals, such as mental health professionals, so that there would be appropriate response to police calls. You don't always need the same kind of services when you call the police. That's a topic I haven't heard mentioned, so I bring that one up from our group.
Excellent.
I can share from group 6, very similar to what other groups have already shared. We talked about dwindling diversity in our communities. We talked about the lack of affordable housing, both for rentals and homes for purchase, and how if there were areas that or apartment complexes that were more affordable, they've either been torn down or refurbished, and residents that used to live there can no longer live there. And I guess we don't have solutions yet, but we were all on a similar page.
We have about 1 minute left in our official time that we had together, but the various members of the consulting group and the city is available and wants to stay online. I am willing to remain here as long as people are interested in staying online and sharing their thoughts and ensuring that we have access to all of the perspectives and things that are important that you want to share. But we also want to respect the time that you have already allocated toward this process. And on behalf of everyone who works for the city of Decatur, who is vested in putting this event on and getting as much information as possible to be in service to us, as I am a citizen along with you, that I want to thank them. But I also, more importantly, want to thank you, that this is not possible change is not possible unless you are willing to show up and add your voice and speak your truths, and more importantly, demand and agitate for change. And I am thankful that each and every one of you have decided to allocate a tremendous amount of your time when you've already spent so much of it on Zoom today and this week and over the course of the time that we have been sequestered, because that is how we make the city of Decatur better. And I am personally deeply appreciative of all of you. And please, let's not make this the last time that you add your voice. Let's continue to find outlets to do so. So on behalf of the Better Together Advisory Board, I thank you and I appreciate your time and energy. And for those who have to leave and do other things, please feel free to do so. For others who want to stay because you have things that's on your mind or on your heart and you need an audience to express those, I am here. People from the city will be here, and those from the consulting group will be here. So once again, much love. So please, for those who are here and you have some things to share, please feel free. Let's talk. Let's chat.
So Ed, I have a question for you. I'm curious, what was the driver to get the city of Decatur to even dive into this?
For this particular event, or well, so
speaker series and
the
all
speaker
that.
series.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, so I have been a part of the Better Together Advisory Board for I think about 3 years now. And at the heart of the agenda that we have is really this fundamental question of how do we make a city that's more welcoming and inclusive and responsive to the needs of the various members of our neighbors, and that there are two sort of pieces to that sort of shows up. One is, how do we create just sort of a foundational understanding of what the needs are of people who don't experience the world the way you do? So we've done some things like used the Decatur Focus to recommend books that we could read that gives us an idea of people who have experiences that are different from us. We've also done some things like recognize businesses that we think have done an outstanding job of creating inclusive environments. And in many ways, this was a natural outgrowth of that, but there was an impetus for it. And that really was the events that took place in Minneapolis, where we all saw a police officer lean on the back of the neck of a Black man who begged for his mama at the time that he was dying, and that we realized that something had to be done, not only to respond to that event because exigency, it was a moment that required all of us to speak and say something, even if we didn't have the words. But also, how do we use that as a foundation, not just to respond to that moment, but to create a larger conversation around what the individual and collective needs are? So we thought that the speaker series of bringing some people in to give us some recommendations and then having this conversation back and forth with other people in the city was a step. And we understood it to be one step. But so it's sort of that combination of things that came to play.
Right. Well, again, I just from a person, so I live in South Fulton, and I heard about the speaker series, but so you all have done a spectacular job. As a matter of fact, I'd like to reach out to some of you later to find out a little bit more about how you got there. But you guys have done a great job. It's wonderful.
Thank you. I am more than willing to talk to you, my friend. Anytime you want to have a conversation about the speaker series or anything else that's going on. And so please reach out.
I'm gonna take you up on that. So
yes.
Hey, Ed, I just want to say thank you. I've been listening and watching and really absorbing all of this. And, I'm a lifer, and, this Decatur has changed immensely from the time we got here to now. And, some of these conversations we need to have and we have to have. And, this is one of the reasons I ran for office, because sitting on the sideline wasn't going to get it done. And I have an obligation to make sure that we have these uncomfortable conversations in a format where everyone feels comfortable sharing their stories. I mean, I've shared mine throughout, various campaigns, and, there's still more to the story. And I think as we start to connect these dots and create all these connections to all the people in our community and communities, Brother Daniels, who is joining us from South Fulton. This is what gives me hope that we are going to be a leader, not a follower, because we have to lead. We have to lead. So thank you for doing a great job. I mean, I get to hear you and see you in some ways that others don't. So I appreciate all that you continue to do. And we're fortunate that you live in this city, and all those at the table now live in this city who really want to be a part of the solution. And on behalf of the entire city commission, thank y'all, because we've got work to do, but we can be that beacon. No pun intended, beacon. We can be that beacon for all the change that needs to happen, and it can start here. So thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you. One of the, and I don't know if I know I'm not just talking to city officials, because Sarita's here, but one of the things that sort of shows up, and I think about doing these types of conversations, are who gives themselves permission to be vulnerable and to just say the thing that they feel is not the right thing to say. That I'm not saying the sort of overtly racist things, that we've gotten past that. I'm thinking about the things that folks who are uncomfortable saying that they don't want to pay more taxes for there to be more low-cost housing in the city, or that we don't, ask the question, what does it mean for us to have more affordable housing? And how do we create space for those things to be said and questions to be asked, not so that they sidetrack where the values are of the city or what we're trying to achieve, but for us to get to that place where Marianne Banks was talking about the convergence of interests, because we need to know what the interests are of the various parties and what they are, what they want, in order to find a place of compromise. And so I think that we still have a lot of people who understand the ways of Decatur and that they're not willing to voice their discontent about that, or that they voice their discontent on Facebook and then don't engage in the negotiations. And that's the tough thing, creating those spaces. But that's the thing that I am interested in and I want to do. And that I'm appreciative that I live in a city that allows for me to find some outlets to do that. So thank you.
Dr. Lee, if I could just chime in. My name is Charlene. I just started working for the city of Decatur literally this Monday. I recently graduated, thank you. I recently graduated from UGA, and I think what you're sharing about kind of go dogs, what you're sharing about creating space for people to feel comfortable sharing those, I guess, less acceptable views, I would say, took me back to a conversation that I had with an administrator on campus a couple of years ago, where she explained to me that there's a difference between a safe space and an open forum or an open dialogue. And so when we ask for one of those things, we have to be very clear about what we're asking for and what we're going to expect. Because there's a space for both of those. Like a safe space is one thing, but if you actually don't want to invite those views in, you want to make people feel comfortable with certain identities, then like that's one thing. But I think being very clear about the fact that you want people to be open with those views that they're not entirely sure are accepted by people is something that's very important. And I think that's a very difficult thing to do because, as you said, like people have to be willing to be vulnerable and they have to be willing to bring their whole selves and also know or believe that people aren't going to judge them or chastise them for those views, but they'll actually be willing to help them learn and kind of grow moving forward. So also just want to thank you for facilitating this discussion too. I'm just very impressed to see, I've been looking at like the number of participants on here, and it is very impressive to see that there were over 80 people to show up for this conversation at 6 o'clock on a weekday. So like kudos to all of you.
Much appreciated. And it's Ed, Charlene. I agree with you. One of the ways in which there's I think that we've sort of moved from the safe space to some people talking about things in terms of sort of brave space. How do we build the capacity to embrace that vulnerability, which is what you're speaking to? I think one of the other ways for us to maybe think about this is for us to have an understanding of the difference between conflict and abuse. That conflict really is just us trying to negotiate the allocation of power. Abuse is the use of power over. We should never accept abusive relationships where power is imposed on another person, whether we're talking verbally, whether we're talking physically, whether we're talking psychologically. But we should be willing to lean into conflicts where we're willing to negotiate how power gets used, because power doesn't disappear. Once power is there, it's ultimately just a question of how it gets allocated. How do we equip people in order to understand how they are using power and how they can leverage the use of power in other ways? And I fear that we conflate those things too often, and that doesn't get us anywhere productively. But I also understand that what I just said, that there are some people who could take that and say, oh, I should accept an abusive relationship and try to figure out how to negotiate the power. But no, there's a difference between conflict and abuse. Let's figure out how to negotiate our conflicts. I will step off my soapbox. I feel like I was like in teaching mode then. I feel like
You're in your preaching mode. Forget teaching mode. Ed. You're in your preaching mode, brother.
They tend to be one and the same. If you're in the teaching mode, I have a question that I've puzzled with through all of this. I've loved the speaker series. I love the idea of having these conversations. And I also feel frustrated because 10 minutes to discuss the issues that any of these, any one of these questions, 10 minutes was not enough to really discuss them. And we talked about in our group, when we got to the policies and practice part, we need a review of every policy in the city and what its impact is. And we need to make sure that we have people at the table from all different perspectives. And we have to find a way to engage them that you were just talking about, where they're brave. So it may not be a safe space in the sense of it feels totally comfortable, but they're brave enough and there's no abuse going on. What's the next step? Like, how are we going to go forward with this? Because I participated in these kind of things in a variety of settings, and then it usually stops here. And I leave with a frustration that I don't want to leave with, because I lived in Decatur in the 80s. And then I moved away for 17 years. And then I came back and I wanted to be in Decatur. And it's a different city than it was when I left. And I want us to be able to have those kind of conversations. So I'm just wondering what your plans are, what the thoughts are about where things go next. So there are sort of two things that I think comes out of this and evolves out of this. I guess the first thing that I want to say is that I appreciate the frustration that I hear, even as someone who's a rhetorician, that I study and think about communication a lot. I can appreciate the concerns that mere rhetoric, the conversation stops, and that there's a difference between talking and acting, and how does it translate into policy change? I have a deep appreciation for that discontent. I think that from a city perspective, we are going through a process of the strategic planning process, and that this information that gets collected is to get an understanding of where we are as a city and what direction we want to go in, and that it will help formulate the strategic plan that then serves as the foundation for what the policies, practices, and procedures are moving forward. That's the long game, and I appreciate the long game, but I'm also someone who appreciates the urgency of now. And there are outlets that we have in the city that can be pressure points that encourages us to move a little faster. That if we think about the tremendous amount of work that Beacon Hill has done since 2015, that's an outlet, that's a pressure point, and they did it by pushing. I'm a part of an organization, Sarita is part of an organization that I think can serve as a similar outlet for, here are the things that need to be done. One of the things that I took from Rutledge, your question, and even from hearing some ways of other people asking questions, like, I don't even know what the policies are. I don't know what the practices are. I don't know what the things are that I should be pushing up against. Is that maybe part of our next conversation is that we should be having conversations where people can educate us around, how do we read the budgets and the allocation of them? How do we read the way in which we think about policing in this country, and what practices are that we should or should not be concerned about? Even thinking about the ways in which we allocate from the arcane policies that no one thinks about except for businesses. I think that all of us, even those who don't own businesses, are interested in, should be thinking about those things. How do we find people who can help us as lay folks have a better understanding of that. And I think that that is some of the work that Better Together should be doing. We see ourselves as a connection point between other members of the city and the governing bodies of the city. And that's one thing that we can do. And so your question and some other things got me thinking about that as something I will take to our collective as something we should be doing and figuring out how to do potentially.
Thank you. I like that.
Ed, if I could offer, again, being interloper doesn't necessarily live in the city, it's easier to say. But so 2 points. 1 point is the importance of taking of being realistic about how this gets solved. This is really a journey. It's like success. There's no destination. You don't ever get there.
Yeah.
It's always striving, that conversation about a more perfect union. It's a journey. So we as citizens of this country cannot expect the folks like Brother Powers and others that are in elective office to fix all of it. They have a role in it. So the coalition has a role in it, but we all have a role. And the first focus is on our circle of influence. How can we influence the folks that are around us and the community that we live in, that type of thing. And again, not only realizing that they can't do it all, but we can't do it all either. And to find the joy and the excitement in just a couple of steps. As long as we get a little bit further down the road, then the last thing I'll say is that I don't, as a kind of a futurist at heart, I don't believe that we're going to be able to fix the past. So the past, we have a choice to use it as a reference or as a residence. I prefer to use it as a reference point. What is it that we want? Not how do we fix all the things that are wrong, because there's a lot of them, but what really do we want? And how much energy do we put into what we want? And these conversations help us start to zero in on. So here's what I want. Here's what a inclusive community looks like. Here's what an inclusive business community looks like, what schools look like. And how do we put effort and energy into that? And again, I think we're going to get there a lot quicker than solving all of the challenges for the last X number of years. So just an opinion.
Yeah. I do, David, as you were talking, one of the things my mind went back to was that piece of Tim Wise where he talked about the role of networks and how networks function in order to allocate opportunities in our society. And that we all do this. Like I want to have conversations with Black men with beards, with Malcolm X glasses, and who wears a bow tie and thinks that you're undressed if you're not wearing a pocket square, although I haven't had a pocket square in a few months but I look forward to going back to my times when I get to put on a little pocket square, because that's me. It's a reference back to who I am and my value system. And I have to shake myself at times to say, just because that's the way in which you orient your life doesn't mean that is the right way to orient your life, and that there is much to be learned from by engaging people who are not like you. And I think that that's the thing at sort of a micro level, an individual level, that we can start doing. What are the groups that we're hanging out with? Who are the people that we're taking time to engage? And are we asking for folks to enter into our lives who are going to occasionally tell us that we're wrong? And I think that's an important part of this, that we can sort of reshape the networks that we have. And that if we can start thinking about who's being interviewed, and are we showing up talking about fit? And when I go and ask somebody out to lunch, am I doing it because they're going to tell me that I'm right? Or are they doing it because they're going to help me grow in our conversation? I think at some individual level, those are some ways that we can start to orient our lives and ourselves that makes this a little easier. Oh, one day, tweed jacket and pocket square.
Ed, you're starting to sound like another professor that went to Northwestern.
Other thoughts? What's on people's minds?
There, my name's Rochelle. I know many of you. Nice to see y'all. Thank you for those in public service still being on here tonight late. Tony, thank you especially for your leadership, and Angela and everyone else there. Of course, I have to say this because people know me, know I'm a affordable housing developer for 20 years or 26 years, based here in Decatur and live here in Decatur. I was appreciating hearing so many groups talk about affordable housing as one practical way that we can address, racial equity and diversity. And I would just ask whoever's, going to be involved with making decisions. Tony, you all, so I was singing your praises about the city commissioners this past year, really stepped up to the plate about affordable housing. And I know in my group, everyone was really interested in seeing more of that. And it was nice to hear other groups shouting out tonight, just sort of connecting the dots that might be one of the lower hanging fruits to get some real momentum for making change in our community to promote diversity and equity. So I hope that that's part of the 2030 vision that continues on, each day that we're trying so hard to make a difference. So thanks everybody. And Ed, thank you so much for your leadership. I feel like I've gone to church, so thank you so much.
Holly, you wanted to jump in and say something.
Oh, no, I just wanted to say the same thing. I wanted to thank Decatur and you and everybody who's been part of these. I did miss the one in December. Somehow I guess I lost the Zoom link, but I think it's an important continuing dialogue, and it is important for us. There some things came out in our small group about like when we had back in the days pre-COVID when we had gatherings in the square. To always keep in mind that whether it's vendors or everybody else, that it's well represented and that people from different walks of life feel comfortable. And I think having these kind of dialogues on a regular basis will be an important part of that. And maybe people who didn't attend this time might attend it at another time. And of course, the speaker series was incredible. I remember the first one, I was so shocked because I wasn't I thought it was just going to be a tape and it was live. And I was like, oh my God, we're talking to this person live. But anyway, I just want to thank Decatur and everybody involved with this for both this particular one as well as the speaker series. I'm not sure how they're connected, but they are. And I just think it's been very worthwhile, and I hope it can continue in some fashion. The other person mentioned we need to keep going, but I think there's still a need in the community of people who move in new or who aren't part of the people who, they need to be drawn in as well as new people move in so that they're part of the dialogue. So I think, I don't know how it would be done. It must be very work intensive to put these on, but I'm greatly appreciative of them.
Well, we appreciate you being here.
So Ed, I've just been thinking about the concept of reconciliation and reparations, and so I'm wondering whether that might have a role. I'm just sort of throwing that out there. I think there's a lot to be thankful for, but also a lot to be sorry for, and a lot of damage done, for decades. That we, got to consider atoning for. And I just don't, obviously have an answer, but I think it's, there's some, real work that really hard work and expensive work that will probably need to take place to kind of move down that road. Just wondering if anybody else has some thoughts about that.
Well, I've thought about it, especially my neighborhood also has a reading group on anti-racism as well as whatever Decatur's doing. I've thought about that, and when you look back, not just necessarily Decatur, which of course Decatur has it very much so historically, but nationally, we've deprived GI loans. We've denied housing, mortgages. We've done all sorts of things over the decades, and I really think, I mean, you always get slapped with these white lawsuits saying, well, you know, we're being discriminatory. Well, I think it's so interesting they file those, but I think we really have to do something to make up for the lack of inherited wealth and the prevention of people from buying property or being able to create. When I say wealth, I'm talking about being able to buy a home and being able to save money or being prevented to have jobs. And you go back historically, you know, it's a long history. And I also read a few years ago about the Chinese not being able to buy property there in California, and it was some national law. So it's not just limited to one group. It just seems that something should be done. I don't know what would work. Maybe a low interest or no interest loan, but how you would do it would have to be almost in a reparations kind of way. But it's something we have to make up the huge disparity somehow. I just don't know how you do it. Has anybody heard discussions of what would be reasonable that I don't know. I mean, it's been so vast and it's still continuing that I can't even picture how it would come about. But
I show up, and I'm also being cognizant of time and where we are, and not wanting to monopolize the direction with my own sort of thoughts and feelings around this. But I show up here to this conversation in some ways as a student of history, understanding that there were intentional decisions that were made about the allocation of resources that created the tremendous amount of disparities along the lines of race, whether it was through redlining, where there were certain community people were able to live in particular communities, or whether it was folks who got access to the GI Bill and the Social Security Fund, or whether or not we accounted for people who were servants in homes and dealt with agriculture, and that they were accounted for benefits from the federal government, that there were de jure policies, on the book policies, that have decided and determined the allocation of opportunities and who got to be in the middle class. And so the wealth gap that exists along the lines of race was really created by a set of folks who were sitting in seats like many of our government officials many, many moons ago, making some very different decisions from folks who are in our governmental seats now. But it has left you all to clean up a mess. And I'm sorry for that, but it's a mess that you I think have to be on the front lines and helping to figure out how to do that. And so, Hugh, you're asking about notions of reconciliation, to bring into balance, to repair a rupture. And to me, to repair that rupture and bring it into balance is to understand that history. And I don't think we can totally repair it, but I do think that there's lots more that can be done to be accountable to it.
And this is Leslie. I just want to add to what you're saying and really echo and support the words that you're saying. And I would just say that if we are to look at reparations or something to try to rectify the atrocities of our this country's past, that they should span generations the way that those decisions span generations. And so whatever that looks like, financially, education, whatever components it has, that it should span generations for, I would say, Black and Indigenous people at a minimum. And that it should also be coupled with some supportive resources. Like, don't just give me money and then expect me to know what to do with it. Also, give me the education, give me the financial literacy, give me the opportunity to open a business, start a business if I want to. Let it be a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah. I appreciate the direction you're heading in your thoughts, Leslie, a lot.
I was going to make a quick comment, say hello first, and nice to meet you to Charlene, whom I may not run into for a while. But welcome to the city. And this 202 for me tonight has been really powerful. And I heard Rutledge make a comment about, short-term, long-term, and just to touch on the strategic plan. And I'm thankful this is part of that conversation, because what we'll be able to do, what I would like to do and hope this conversation this night and the future conversations result in is holding space. Hopefully that's what the next 10-year plan is. If we come out, if these conversations, these revelations and these nuggets we're bringing together tonight, we hold space for folks. Someone else made the insightful comment, opening up the blind spot and speaking for and standing for people who aren't here at the table anymore or yet. So I guess that's what I'd like to say about what this can do for the long term. I feel the urgency in the short term, and just looking back to the spring, the meeting where we made an allocation of funding towards, the first tranche of anti-racism discussions. But that was in the fog of war, right? So we're climbing out of that. I feel a little more secure, and I know we can make more decisions in that direction, and hopefully not in that environment. So it's good work. I appreciate you, Ed. And again, welcome, Charlene. It's nice meeting to be on tonight. I want to go deeper and go further. And just wanted to say that I hear my troops marching around downstairs and I got to go. But thanks to everybody. It was good to see your faces.
Yeah. I know that you're heading out, Kelly. I fundamentally agree with you that the holding space is a critical component of this, because it's the way in which we build trusting communities. That what we want to do is figure out, how do we create a critical mass of people where you feel as if you're on the outside if you're not participating in the conversation. And that's where we are. That is part of the natural scope of what it means to be a part of Decatur, is to host and engage in these types of conversations where we challenge people. And I think that we've made some significant strides in that direction. And so I appreciate you and the others on the commission who have made this possible.
Let me just say, Ed, we are the conduit of the people. So we are doing what the people tell us to do. We just have to have the courage to go forth and do it.
Ooh, give the people what they want.
That's right.
Well, again, from someone who doesn't necessarily vote for you all, I heard once that money is only an issue in the absence of value. And the fact that you all have invested in this process, it says an awful lot. It just really says an awful lot about how important it really is. It's interesting to hear people, in the public and private sector, in the aftermath of George Floyd, the statements are flying left and right, but folks don't invest anything in it. And I'm wondering where a lot of them are going to end up when we get around to the anniversary. So it's really encouraging to see what you all have done, and the fact that the city as a government has invested in something that, again, it can't solve it all, but it can't be absent either. And so it's really encouraging to see what you all are doing.
Ed, quick question. What's the full name of Beacon?
The Beacon Hill Alliance for Human Rights.
Black Alliance, the Beacon Hill
Black
Black.
Alliance, yeah. The Beacon Hill Black Alliance for Human Rights. Any other thoughts?
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
This is Phil Cuffey, and I am a member at large of Beacon Hill Black Alliance for Human Rights. And I just want to commend Ed and Tony and Kelly and Holly for the comments that you've made, as well as others. I think this is an important conversation that we're having. And as a fairly newcomer to Decatur, and I have been active in the community, particularly around the issue of affordable housing, I appreciate the conversation you're having, but I want to encourage everyone to really look at how we can make meaningful and measurable progress on the topic of equality. Because I think that's really what it comes down to, what we can do to make this community one that is based on the fundamental practices of equity across housing, across economy, across healthcare, education, because quite frankly, what it is that we want in terms of people of darker hue, people who are in, I don't like to use this term minority, but it's the common parlance. What they want is pretty much what everyone else wants. An environment that's safe, an environment that is open to each of us to live our full potential on an equal level playing field. And I think this conversation is really the beginning of it. But I'm one who operates with a sense of urgency, because we do need to make meaningful and measurable progress so that when we look back at this conversation, we can say, okay, what did we accomplish? What did we really accomplish in terms of speaking truth to power, in terms of really making this community more equitable? And I think that's really what we have to press our leaders and our members in the community to strive for. Because without that, we get a sense of frustration that I've heard, a sense of impatience I've also heard. And so we have to, I think, get to a point where we're willing to make some of the difficult decisions. And there have been some examples in Providence, in North Carolina, I think Asheville, some other communities where they've either by executive order of the mayor or by a majority decision by the commissioners of city council, they've made progress in terms of leveling the playing field to address the inequities of the past. And we're living in a community where at one point, and I'm coming from Philadelphia, but what I've learned is at one point DeKalb County was known for the Klan. And Stone Mountain was a place of major meetings. And living in the South, there was a time when people would bring their children and gather as a community to see a human being lynched. And And prior to that, we all know that the cannon in Decatur Square represents genocide. So we have to be serious as a community to address these ills of our past and take meaningful and measurable. I'm going to leave you with M&M. Make it meaningful and make it measurable in terms of the progress that we take as a community to make it meaningful change, measurable change that we can say we lived at this time. We addressed the seriousness of the inequity and we took action to level that playing field and make it better for the people who live in the community and for the generations to come. Comments or questions? Mm-hmm.
I appreciate Eminem.
Okay, that's good to hear. Right.
That's inspiring, Phil. I guess what I'd say is it makes you want to swing for the fences, really.
Yes, we have to.
I always make sports analogies. I don't know why.
Hey, Phil, I will say this, I think, part of, you and I have had this discussion. It's, about that will. And, I think we keep pushing, we, the commissioners push each other, in the right way. The community pushes us in the right way. So it's all about that push. And as long as we're all pushing, there will be inertia and there will be momentum. It may not always go the right direction, but there will be momentum. So we just got to keep pushing each other. And I don't think Eminem said that.
That was more like Dr.
I'm
Dre.
getting hungry.
That was more like... So we officially ended at 8. It is now 8:48. And so I am nourished by these conversations. I'm appreciative of them, but I also feel like I'm in a position with power that I don't want to have, but I think that people are thinking that I will dismiss in some way. But like the fact that we still, like the beautiful thing about this for me is that as someone who lives in the city, that I show up as someone who considers me just a little old me plugging away at my life. And I know various members of the city governance who is here. And I knew you before this time and we talked, and that you are still here at 8:49. And that I appreciate. And I think that says something, because I am not one who believes you need everybody on board. I am one who believes that old saying, you need a small group of dedicated people who are vested in change with some resources, who are willing to exercise that. And we got a small group of people who are dedicated to change with resources. Things are going to happen. And so thank you for being a part of the collection who is going to make that happen. And please let me know when, how I can be a part of the revolution that you all are creating. I'm all about making good trouble whenever it can be made. So invite me, use me, let me know. And so I think that at 8:50, after 2 hours and 50 minutes of love, conversation, fermenting the revolution and laying the seeds for a bountiful crop of equity and racial justice. We will part ways here, but for not long, because we will make way and opportunity for us to come back together and continue conspiring for justice. So on that note, much love, and we will see each other again very soon.
Peace, love, and soul.